Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 15, Episode 11. I'm your host, Dean Jones. I hope that everyone has had a lovely Thanksgiving holiday and is recovering from the Black Friday shopping. Today I'm speaking with Christopher Beckman, who is born in San Francisco and has a doctorate in Near Eastern Archaeology. Based in Geneva, his research focuses on the links between material culture and the subsistence patterns. He has lived in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe with a stint in Hollywood producing horror films. His new book, A Twist in the Tale, How the Humble Anchovy Flavored Western Cuisine, is now out. I will take you to my conversation with author Christopher Beckman.
Film producer and globetrotter, Dr. Chris Beckman, who joins us today to talk about his new book, A Twist in the Tale, How the Humble Anchovy Flavored Western Cuisine. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dean. I'm thrilled to be here.
Now, I want to go into your book right away because I'm so excited to talk about it. And you and I have been talking about anchovies passionately before we started recording. And this is something we both really love to talk about, I think. So your book traces the fascinating journey of the anchovy through history. What initially sparked your interest in the seemingly humble fish?
Well, for me, it was kind of an inadvertent discovery that anchovies were incredibly divisive. And I always just thought of anchovies as yet just another ingredient. You know, you had many ingredients you would add to a recipe to create a dish. And only kind of later did I really discover just how divisive they were. And that kind of intrigued me. And that sat in the back of my head, worming its way through my thoughts for years until I finally sat down and wrote the book.
I really love how you tackled anchovies through history in the book. And I really am interested in this myself. I remember I read a lot of novels that touch on like maritime history, and they talk about how oftentimes sailors and sailing ships would catch anchovies and then cure them on deck to have as food for their meals. So that's always really
Yes.
been interesting to me. What sparked your interest in the seemingly Hubble fish historically?
Well, it really, one of the real early catalysts was when I was living in Los Angeles and in my 20s, flat broke. I was living on like top ramen, tins of tuna fish, and pasta. And I would prepare meals, sometimes occasionally for my friends. And it was literally just pasta, a little garlic, and maybe some crushed tomatoes. And I remember reading that if you add a little anchovy to it, it completely transforms the flavor of the whole dish. And sure, I tried it and it was great. But where this story takes its interesting twist is that if I served that anchovy infused spaghetti sauce to my guests, everyone loved it. But at the end of the dinner, if I mentioned there was an anchovy in it, I could see somebody's expression change, literally right in front of me. And if I mentioned before we even started dinner, there's going to be anchovies in it, one or two people would invariably say, oh, you know what? I just cannot stand anchovies. I'm sorry, I can't do it, man. I'll just eat bread. So that was my first indication something's up, because often if people know there's an anchovy in it, they'll reject it before even trying it. But if they don't know, that undercurrent of umami is something they respond to really favorably.
I think people have had this perception of anchovies, especially in America. Although it doesn't seem to be shared, especially in Europe, the British don't seem to have this perception of anchovies that we have, and which is really interesting. It makes you wonder why. Can you talk about their perception of the anchovy historically? I mean, I feel like we're lessening that now, but we still have some of it.
That's right.
Maybe not comparatively to when I was a kid in the 70s, maybe it was more biased against, and now we're
Sure,
starting to come where
sure.
people are more accepting.
Yeah, sure, sure. I think in the US, a lot of the anchovy resistance, if you will, has to do with that many people's first exposure to anchovies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was through anchovy pizza. And the anchovies used on those pizzas were invariably terrible, super low quality, giant bulk tins that had been opened, were sitting in the back of the kitchen, exposed to air, oxidizing for months on end, carelessly thrown on the pizza. It was a bitter, horrific experience for everybody. Now that's since improved dramatically. And fortunately, the quality is much better. But you're right. Your point about the British don't have quite the same hangups that we seem to have in America is true. And I think that holds true for most of Southern Europe. But I do need to qualify that with they do have there are folks who detest anchovies like we do, I would say in less numbers, but they have their anchovy haters too. And you can go all the way back through history and they're there as well.
How do you think the anchovy's social status evolved over time? And what do you think this reveals about the broader relationship between food and social hierarchies and social status?
Well, one of the interesting things that really got me excited about doing the book was that the perception of anchovies varied over time and in each different country in different ways. And so in the book, I'm primarily looking at France, Italy, Spain, England, and the US. And what's interesting is that anchovies came in and out of fashion at different times and in different ways and for different reasons in each of those countries. So it's hard to kind of generalize other than I guess you could say that anchovies are the smallest, the boniest, and the oiliest fish that we really eat. And that really set them up as being one of the hierarchically least interesting fish. Now, how they got approached was varied in each country, but I think size really matters when it comes to talking about fish.
Can we talk about something I'm really excited about talking about, since I really love the part in the book that talked about Roman times and how anchovies were
Yes.
used as a flavoring agent in food during that time period. And there was products like garum, garum, and then nowadays we have Worcestershire sauce. Can you talk about those things?
That's right. And one of the interesting things is when we think of the Roman Empire, um, at that time, the three big things involved in trade were wine, wheat, and olive oil. Now, what surprises most people, there's an argument that the fourth most traded commodity in the Roman Empire may have been garum. And Roman garum is simply fish sauce. And so this tells us they were eating a tremendous amount of fish sauce because it's getting traded all over. And a matter of fact, anywhere in the Mediterranean, you find a shipwreck. Invariably, some of the amphora will be holding Roman garum. So we know that the Romans were seasoning everything with this because we can see it in the cookbooks, De Re Coquinaria by Apicius, which almost the second most listed ingredient in the cookbook is Roman garum. So they were using this Roman garum on meat, fish, fowl, grains, vegetables, and even fruit. That's how pervasive and ubiquitous it was. And the reason it was that used that widely is because it's an incredible flavor enhancer. So when you jump to the popularity of Worcester sauce, it's the same story. You know, Worcester sauce is basically a kind of garum that was invented in Britain, 1,800 years later, let's say. And you could take Worcester sauce and apply it. You could enhance your soup. You can put it in a salad dressing. You can put it in a Bloody Mary. You can put it on beef. It's an endless number of dishes it can be added to. But the key is that it's a flavor enhancer, just like Roman garum was.
It makes me laugh because I've seen recipes where they say, oh, if you want to if you don't like anchovies and you want to admit them, use Worcester sauce in a Caesar salad. And I'm like, but it's the same. It's made from anchovies. And people will use Worcester sauce with a plum and then say they hate anchovies. And it's like, but it's made.
That's right. That's right. I mean, a key ingredient in Worcester sauce is the anchovy. So that's exactly right.
Your book talks a lot about the intersection of European and American culinary traditions. Can you discuss specific examples of how the anchovy has bridged this cultural divide?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because for a lot of American history, we really didn't consume anchovies, even though on the East Coast of the United States, from Maine all the way down to Florida, there are anchovies in the US waters. But we really didn't cotton to anchovies. Again, I think they're too small, too oily, too bony when we had an abundance of fish, big fish. an abundance of oysters. You could get in Manhattan, pennies. You could get all the oysters you wanted. So this contrasts with Britain. You know what? I'm sorry, Dan, I forgot the question.
Oh,
Could you begin that
yeah,
again, and I'll
absolutely.
jump in? Sorry, my man.
Yeah, sure. No, it's totally good. Your book explores the intersection of European and American
Ah,
culinary
yes,
traditions. Can you discuss specific examples of how the anchovy has bridged this cultural divide?
yes. Anchovies in America took a long time to get accepted, whereas in Europe, they were being utilized and incorporated into their foodways at a much earlier date. And I think part of the reason why in America we were so slow to accept them is we had such an abundance of other large fish. Why eat an imported anchovy when you could get a huge fillet of cod for next to nothing, pennies on the dollar? You could get oysters all over. So basically, what happened is around the turn of the 19th century, Americans found themselves with a fat purse. We were getting very wealthy very fast. But we felt kind of culturally poor. And so a lot of Americans on the East Coast in particular were taking their cultural cues from France, and in particularly French gastronomy. And at that time, one of the big ways that the French were eating anchovies was in hors d'oeuvres. And consequently, shifting our focus back to Manhattan, we find in upscale restaurants, hors d'oeuvres with a little anchovy on top became very in. It was a marker of sophistication. And it was a way to kind of express your social status that you could go out and afford to buy this imported anchovy fillet. So that's one of the ways anchovies kind of bridged over. The other interesting thing is that anchovies really came in through immigrants, primarily Italian immigrants, but also to a lesser extent Greek and Portuguese. But that phenomena didn't permeate, that phenomena didn't translate over into our American foodways until the post-World War II years. So those are a couple examples of how those anchovies bridged that divide.
I'm starting to see it in cooking more. I know that in a pissaladaire, like it'll be listed with, as an ingredient, and you're seeing people, cooking more with it. Also, like we're asking, people, hey, instead of the big fish, go for some of the smaller things, and people are encouraged to eat
That's
things
right.
like sardines.
Exactly.
White bait is on the menu as an hors d'oeuvre. So you're seeing, a lot of small fish being used. That's an encouragement instead of only going for the big fish that are popular. Do you think that there's an increased attention to sustainable seafood where we envision a future where the anchovy might have a larger role in our gastronomy?
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's very interesting is that Americans in the West in general, we've been a little slow to embrace anchovy and its flavor enhancing potential. And as you mentioned, we know that we need to move towards a more sustainable future. And that means probably less meat, less of these larger big fish, a lot of which have been fished to either they're on the brink of extinction, the stocks are really being decimated, or they're becoming repositories for heavy metals like a lot of tuna and
Hmm.
bonita. So we know we're supposed to be eating more of these small fish. And anchovies are a perfect solution to that. Now, there are some fisheries that have been overfished, but then there are other fisheries that are better managed. I'm thinking of Cantabrian anchovies right now seem to be pretty well managed and are pretty sustainable. Um, so I think we're at an exciting time because as again, we move into these more plant-based diets and plant-based eating, this is where anchovies, I think, have a real role because they can bring some of that umami that we're also conditioned to and we lust after.
You seem to have a lot of fun with your research, and your book draws in a wide range of resources from cookbooks to art. Can you share some of the more surprising or interesting discoveries you made during your research?
Sure. One of the more interesting things, which I completely did not anticipate, was because I've been to Spain several times. I'm currently living in Barcelona. And if you visit Spain, one of the things you see is that when people have a tapas in the late afternoon in a tapas bar, anchovies are very prevalent. And I just assumed, I mean, the Spanish are kind of anchovy mad. So I just assumed there was this big, deep, rich history. But as I started doing the research, I uncovered an absolutely fascinating phenomenon. That is, after 1520, there's one mention of an anchovy in a Spanish cookery book. There's not another mention for the next 200 years. And a matter of fact, the Spanish, for most of their history, despised anchovies because Spanish food is some of the most hierarchical, and the anchovy is simply too small, too bony, too oily. It was too inconsequential for the Spanish to even concern themselves with. So it really wasn't until much later in their history that they started eating anchovies. And that, ironically enough, was due to Italian immigrants on the north coast of Spain. But that's kind of another story. There is one exception and one caveat to that story I should throw out, and that is in the south of Spain, in Malaga, they did eat anchovies, but that was due to earlier Moorish traditions of flowering fish. So they did have a little tradition in Malaga, but the Catholic north of Spain did not eat anchovies and simply was not interested in them.
As an archaeologist, you bring a unique perspective to food history. How did your training influence your approaching to can I say that again? Let's start again. As an
Sure.
archaeologist, you bring a unique perspective to food history. How did your training influence your approach to writing this book?
Well, funny enough, archaeology is one of those professions where you work both in really the micro and the macro world. So, I mean, for example, you analyze, say, pottery, the fabric of a.
As an archaeologist, you bring a unique perspective to food history. How did your training influence your approach to writing this book?
Well, funny enough, archaeology is one of those professions where you work both in really the micro and the macro world. So, I mean, for example, you analyze, say, pottery, the fabric of a potsherd, in order to try and understand where that pot was made so that you can then make hypotheses, inferences about larger social groups that may have used that pot. Did the pot travel with somebody? Was it part of a local tradition? Um, and so, in a very similar way, I was looking at anchovies, and one of the things that I think the archaeology kind of helped was it gave me the kind of language to really do a deep dive. Traditionally, they always thought Roman garum was made primarily with mackerel, and the next would have been bonito, because these are the fish that are mentioned in writing, in literary sources. And so a lot of early scholarship was really bent on Roman garum was made with mackerel. See, we can find these citations. But my sense was that, well, that was probably a very elite thing. And probably, given the amount of fish sauce out there, I actually think much more common fish were being used, like anchovies. And sure enough, when you start really digging through the research, they've done now, more, in the last decade, a lot of research on the microscopic remains in these amphora. And what they're finding, sure enough, is almost all these amphora were made with anchovy bones. And so, despite some of these amphora saying made from the finest garum mackerel, actually what you find inside is anchovy. So I think archaeology kind of helped me understand that language and how to really grasp that.
We talked about this earlier before we started recording, but I wanted to go back and talk about have you always been a fan of anchovies? And if so, how has your personal relationship with this ingredient evolved over time?
Well, interestingly enough, I was never that big of a pro or con with anchovy. Again, I just thought it was another ingredient that one used in cooking. It really wasn't anything special to me. It was only later I found out that it was very divisive and people had a love-hate relationship with it. In terms of how I've changed in my approach, I think early on, I love the taste of anchovies. So I can eat them straight out of a tin, draped on a piece of meat, draped on chicken, draped over a salad like a a niçoise salad. Nowadays, though, I find I'm using them much more subtly. So I'll often use, say, half an anchovy in a vinaigrette. And I would use that in a salad. And it's incredible how flavorful that is. Half an anchovy added with, say, a little olive oil, a little chili pepper, some kale, some garlic, saute that, toss in a third of an anchovy fillet, and it's going to bring this little undercurrent of umami that just, anchovies and the whole brassica family, whether you're talking about, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, they all work incredibly well with just a little bit of anchovy. And if I'm making fish, I might mash a little anchovy with olive oil and rub it into the fish fillet and then broil that. So I'm using less now, but I have to say, just last night, I'm in Barcelona. I, of course, went to the supermarket, bought some tins. I was just out of my mind jonesing. Got some French bread, slathered some butter on, tossed a couple anchovies, and I just devoured it. Basically, was my dinner. So, yeah.
Very nice. What do you hope readers will gain from exploring the role of anchovies through your book?
The biggest takeaway, I hope, is that people can see how extensively and how widely anchovies were used in a huge variety of dishes. And this is a way people can, for very little money and very little time, elevate the flavor of their food to a whole nother level. I mean, Dean, you could tell me pretty much any dish, and I'll tell you anchovies will work with it. Maybe in very small amounts, but it's really surprising what an effective flavor enhancer they are. And again, we talked about this a little earlier, but as we move into a more sustainable future, and I think I've noticed my food is, I'm much more focused on a plant-based diet now. I'm eating far more vegetables and grains and fruits than I used to. This is where anchovies are right at home. They can really elevate and give you that satisfying flavor and taste. And, again, I can go back in the 1600s in Italy and read about where they're taking a quarter of an anchovy, adding a little oil, smearing it on, some polenta, or, the 17th century, adding it to a little pasta or a little pizza or a little, vegetable. They were very cleverly using just a smidgen because that's all they could afford in Italy. So they've been doing it in Italy for thousands of years. And this is something we can do now using their old recipes and techniques and apply it to our modern style of cooking.
A Twist in the Tail came out in October. Now that it's out, what's next for you?
Well, interestingly enough, I just finished a 3-month program of plant-based cooking at Le Cordon Bleu in Kuala Lumpur, which was fantastic. So it was really a deep dive into the grammar and mechanics of plant-based cooking. So I kind of want to take that and parlay that, and I'm not sure how exactly I'll do that, but I want to build upon that. And after the program, I spent a month in Korea and a month in Japan. I just returned 3 days ago, actually, to Barcelona. And it was fascinating to see how Koreans and the Japanese use anchovies, because there's none of this baggage about anchovies in Asia. Again, 1 billion people a day are probably eating anchovies in one form or another, whether they're dried, in fish sauce, fresh, however, in Asia. And there's no controversy or baggage. It's simply a flavor enhancer to be used in different dishes. And so I'd like to really kind of keep exploring that. And who knows, there might be another book in it. Who knows? Maybe the Asian anchovies around the corner.
Very nice. Chris, I love talking to you about your new book. I want to thank you for being on the podcast. If for those listening, you can get his new book, A Twist in the Tail, How the Humble Anchovy Flavored Western Culture, by going to the links in the bio, and it's available at all better bookstores. Chris, thank you for being on the podcast.
Hey, thank you very much, Dean. It was really a pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
That's all the time we have left for on the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. That was my conversation with Professor Christopher Beckman. His new book, A Twist in the Tail, is out through all major outlets, online, and in all better bookstores. You can go to the link in the bio to purchase it also. This book would make a great holiday gift for any foodie or history buff. We have other guests this week, so look out for other episodes. Until next time, I'll see you in the library.